Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me share a little bit about unconscious bias. I am originally from Monterrey, Mexico, and hence the ñ on my piñeiro. Thank you for inviting me as Austin Association of Mediators Association. A little bit about me and my background. I've been in Austin about 30 years, and I spent the first 25 working in corporate America in very large organizations, leading teams that were cross-functional and global. Some of them were inclusive, some of them not so much. But I really got interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion in my experience in corporate America. And I decided what better time than 2019 in a global pandemic to dedicate fully to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I have been helping now organizations become more inclusive and more effective by becoming more diverse. I became a mediator because this is such a delicate subject. And when there's a lot of conflict, you don't have the ability to impact the learning that needs to happen and the cultural change that needs to happen for organizations to become more inclusive. And so I have been doing mediation over the last couple of years. It's been such a wonderful journey. I participate closely with the Dispute Resolution Center. And so let's talk a little bit about the process and what we're doing today, because sometimes people like to see the map of what is happening and where we're at. So very important for you to know that today is only the beginning. We are going to be able to show you what the definition is of unconscious bias, understand where it comes from, become a little bit more aware of the impact of unconscious bias, and give you some strategies and skills for you to interrupt it. Now, that's where we stop today, and that's where the hard work really starts, where you actually continue learning, and then you go through a process of self-awareness and reflection that can help you identify really what are your individual biases, and then putting in the work. That last step is the hardest part. And it's an ongoing journey, something that you will continue to go through for the rest of your life, essentially. I love to start by sharing a little bit about what is bias, because there's so many definitions. And I like to keep it simple. Bias is essentially a preference for or against something, or a group, or a person. And biases can be held by us as individuals, or by groups of people and families, or communities and schools, or actually institutions. And I like to show this picture of I was going to call it an igloo. Sometimes Spanish interferes with my English. Iceberg. Because there are those biases that we are aware of and that are on top of the surface. And there are some biases that are operating underneath our awareness, and they're below the surface. And so there's these two different aspects that we're going to explore today. So first, oops, yes. First, we're going to talk about those explicit biases, or those that are on top of the surface. These biases and preferences are those that you are fully aware of. And when they come to the bad kind of biases, and it's just not a positive preference, these are those that are very closely associated with things like discrimination and oppression, racism. And sometimes we don't even see that they are these biases. And I put a couple of quotes there that show how biases can be very explicit. So somebody might say, well, we like to hire extroverts. And there is, this very outspoken preference that you do not like to deal with introverts. And working in diversity, we know that it takes everyone to really create the best outcomes. Or some people that are not comfortable working with women, and they might say it as something that is just their personal working preference. And so these are some of the things that you're very, very aware. I'm going to share a very simple and food related explicit bias or preference that I have, and that is chocolate. I love chocolate and I don't like white chocolate. So there are things that we are just very aware of. Now, an important question to think about with explicit biases is whether your culture and your policies and your organization are actually promoting inclusiveness. Because people have been shown to be more motivated to control their own biases when the norms and the expected behaviors are very explicit around not accepting biases. So that's something to keep in the back of your mind in terms of those of you that work with organizations. Do you have those policies in place that explicitly call out that acting in a prejudiced way is not acceptable? So implicit biases. Going back to my food preference, to make it very simple, I just recently became aware of something that I don't like, and that is Brussels sprouts. And I did not know why I did not like Brussels sprouts. And that's not something that I grew up eating in Mexico. But I realized as my husband loves Brussels sprouts, and every time he made them, because he loves to cook, I would be like, oh my God. And so I had to think back, why do I not like them? And I realized some of the experiences where I got exposed first to Brussels sprouts. And now I have realized that actually they can be pretty good, especially those with that you buy from fresas that have the aioli. But that's a very simple example of an implicit bias that I had a preference against something. Now, these implicit biases, when we talk about the social context, they're a lot more complex and they are triggered automatically. So you are not aware when they are being triggered, and they can be positive or negative, but they do affect every decision and every action that we take. Now, on the right-hand side of that iceberg, I like to introduce the concept of your values. I believe that most of us have egalitarian values. I think that everyone on the call wants to be just and neutral in our mediation practices. And we want a society that is equitable for everyone. So when we have our values that are above the surface and we're very aware of what our values are, and we are faced with biased responses that do not align with those values, and the awareness of those responses, we end up with a phenomenon that psychologists call cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is a very powerful emotion because it creates a lot of discomfort when people realize that their values and their actions are not matching with each other. So when you, we're going to be talking a little bit later about different signs that you can have and different strategies to combat unconscious biases. But one of these strategies is when you are feeling cognitive dissonance, think about where that's coming from, because this can lead to a very powerful thing where you change your attitudes and therefore reduce your prejudice, and you change your behaviors. So overall, as a community, we can reduce discrimination. Okay, so where do biases come from? Well, there's two different places where biases come from. One of them has its basis in biology. So every minute we are exposed to about 11 million bits of information. And according to Tim Wilson from the University of Virginia, we are only aware of 40 of those 11 million bits of information. The reason why this happens is because if we had to process all the information that is coming at us, we would end up with cognitive overload, unable to really do anything but try to process all that information. I'm thinking about the RAM in our brains would just be constantly just going. And so we have evolved to have our brain create categories where we very easily put in those 11 million bits of information into categories that make this information a lot easier to process. So we categorize activities and people, and our brain is automatically doing this in the background. And we then have the ability to process those things that we need to deal with at any given moment. On the other side of the coin, we have the biases that are socially created. And these start from the moment we're born with our family. As we then go to school, our peers, our teachers, we start watching TV, and then go into social media. We're influenced by society, our peers, our colleagues, the organizations we belong to. So although they start forming at a very early stage in our life, practically when we're born, they continue being formed as we move through life. I'm going to ask you to look at this picture and put in the chat, what table do you think is larger, the one on the left or the one on the right? And if you wouldn't mind going to the chat and giving me your perspective. The one on the right. Anybody else? One on the left? Okay. Jack says they're the same. It depends. Left, the right. My brain says right. Yep. Well, I am going to include this picture in a handout that we will send along with the credit, because what I would like you to do is print it out and print it out and cut it. Cut the area of one of those tables. What you're going to see is that they are exactly the same size. So what is happening right now is that your brain is filling in the gaps. We are so used to operating in a three-dimensional space that our brain is looking at these tables that are in 2 dimensions and is making a judgment based on what we're used to perceiving in the real world. So when I look at this, I think that the one on the left is skinny and longer. The one on the right, I believe it's a little bit shorter and wider. But the reality is that it's the same. When I first saw these tables and I found out that they were the same size, I continued to be in disbelief that they were the same size. I actually had to go and prove that for myself. So the reason I point that out is that even when you are told certain pieces of information, you continue to process the way that your brain has categorized different things. So that's kind of an interesting experiment. Now, I would like to share with you the process. Now, this is probably the most information heavy part of our conversation. But what I want to walk you through is how we go from this categorization that we know that we do, which they're created to avoid our cognitive overload, into the formation of stereotypes. So what are stereotypes? Well, they are very unreliable generalizations. They tend to be very binary, black and white, good or bad. They tend to be absolute. These stereotypes are not complex or sophisticated descriptions of people. They're really hard to pin down figuring out what stereotypes we have is difficult because when they come into play, they come into play without any animus, without any feelings for them. So the fact that we acquire generalizations, these generalizations through what I would call cultural osmosis, makes it really hard because they're constantly coming in at us. We're grabbing them, they're becoming part of us, and we do not know that they're there. So there are negative, neutral, and positive stereotypes. You know, some of them that are very common is if you're overweight, you're lazy. With 9/11, a lot of people grabbed onto the stereotype that if you are of Arabic descent, you must be a terrorist, or that women are bad drivers. Now, I'm going to share that I actually have that stereotype that women are bad drivers. And of course, I feel that I'm the exception to the rule. I think I'm the best driver I have ever met. But every time that I'm on the highway and I see a car behaving erratically, and then I pass by it and I see a woman, I find myself saying, well, of course it's a woman. And when I catch myself saying that, knowing what I know, this is what I realized. What I'm experiencing there is a confirmation bias, because probably as many times as I've driven past a bad driver, I've seen that as a man, as that I've seen that as a woman. But in my mind, my stereotype is, well, it's a woman, it's a bad driver. So that really becomes what I am more aware of. And so the good thing is that I am very aware of this stereotype that I carry. And I make it a point so that every time it bubbles up, I'm like, okay, stereotype, not the truth, and definitely not something that I want to perpetuate. So I'm very careful with what I state in the car with my 10-year-old daughter and my 16-year-old stepdaughter, because there's also a thing that is a self-fulfilling, where if you tell somebody they're not good at math or they're a bad driver, they actually end up behaving accordingly to that stereotype. So I'm very aware with that. The other part is neutral. You know, some people think that a leader is a man, and that can be neutral. Now, it's not neutral when you say a woman cannot be a leader. In that case, it's a negative stereotype. Or they can be very both sided, positive and negative. People sometimes say that Americans are very generous and hardworking. And sometimes people say, well, Americans are loud and can be obnoxious. So there can be stereotypes that go both ways. Now, what happens when you go from having those stereotypes to making these judgments in favor or against something? That becomes your unconscious bias, and you're acting upon it. And as a result, often certain people benefit and certain people get penalized from acting on those unconscious biases. Now, I'm going to tell you a story. And if you have heard this story, I'm going to ask you not to comment when it's time to comment until later. But if you haven't heard it, if you don't mind, you can close your eyes and just listen to this story. A father and a son were involved in a car accident in which the father was killed and the son was seriously injured. The father was pronounced dead at the scene of the accident, and his body was taken to a local morgue. The son was taken by ambulance to a nearby hospital and was immediately wheeled into an emergency operating room. A surgeon was called. Upon arrival and seeing the patient, the attending surgeon exclaimed, "Oh my God, it's my son." Can you put in the chat your reaction to that story? Who is speaking? Any thoughts? You smart people. Stepfather. Well, a lot of you got it. and you are more aware than most, because a lot of people, when they hear the story first, myself included, I made up stories about how the biological dad maybe was the father, and then the adopted dad was the surgeon, and so in my mind, I was trying to fit the idea that the surgeon had to be a man. And this is something that happens very, very often. So now I'm going to share with you a few examples of biases that are very interesting from a race perspective. There's a lot of impacts to healthcare coming about from biases in race. If anybody has been to the emergency room, one of the first things that they do is put a pulse oximeter on you, on your hand, on your finger. And what we have found now is that these pulse oximeters, when applied to dark skin, their accuracy is greatly reduced. So we see how products have been developed with an unawareness of the diversity that exists, and therefore resulting in a bias where the care, the critical care that you need in an ER could be affected. Another case that I didn't know until one of my best friends highlighted it. I used to work at Facebook, and all of our syncs are automatic, like in many places. And she came to visit, and when she came out, she was really frustrated, and she had a lot of paper in her hand. And I was like, what's happening? And she said, well, the sinks would not turn on for me. I'm like, why? I was just in there. She's like, well, many times the activation sensor in those sinks is not accurate when it's dark skin that is trying to activate them. So that was, again, something very difficult for me to hear, that it's an experience that people have that I had never thought about. But there's a lot of biases like these around race, and I'm just hoping to give you a couple of examples that touch on different aspects of diversity. So when we think about height and weight, there's also a lot of biases. Like, for example, did you know that 58% of the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are over 6 feet tall? That is compared to 14% of US adult males. So you have to think, how is height associated with the ability to lead a Fortune 500 company? It's really not. But is there a bias there? Something to think about. Another interesting thing that I learned around weight is there's several experiments that have occurred with college students. In one of them, teams were asked to select teammates, giving them information around IQ, experience in competitive teams like the ones that they were forming, and showing pictures of them and their weight. Now, these groups of students ended up exchanging 9 IQ points for potential teammates with a smaller body weight. And this is where you need to think, like, what does one have to do with the other? And especially in a competition where you want the smartest, most well-prepared people in your team, and you're making decisions about who's going to be on your team based on body weight. So something to think about. And when we get to the end of our conversation, one of the tips that I'm going to suggest that you do is take an implicit association test that can give you some information about where some of your biases might lie. We don't think about regional accents. However, there's been a lot of studies done by a university in Munich and here in the US, where people with strong regional accents end up being paid 20% less than those that don't have a strong regional accent. And again, that applied to the US and the South, that applied to the UK and rural UK accents. And it also applied to Germany, being from Munich or being from the outside. And so I left the last example because it's my favorite and it leaves us with a positive note. So biases around gender. When you think about musicians, the talent of the musician is what you are looking for the most, right? You want people that can do their craft, do their art, play the best in your orchestra. Well, in the 1970s, the majority of the members of the symphony orchestras were male. And there was a little bit of an understanding that that was the case because males were just better musicians. And so the symphony orchestra started doing something very interesting, where they started doing auditions in a blind way. So they basically put up a screen, and when people were selecting the musicians, you couldn't see whether it was a man or a woman. And so what they saw is a great increase in the number of women that were being selected to become part of the symphony orchestras. Now, what they realized later is that although they had put up a screen, the musicians still had to walk on stage. And so most women were wearing heels or some sort of shoe that could tell, that could demonstrate that it was a female walking on. And so what they did then was change it so that candidates had to walk on stage barefoot or with their socks or without shoes that could make a sound. And so this is what happened. You see the numbers up on the screen. 1970, we had 6% of the people were women. 1993, we had 21%. By the summer of 2020, a third of the Boston and half of the New York Philharmonica were women. So that just really gives you a greater understanding of the fact that we can actually counteract our biases, especially in the critical moments. And when I talk to organizations, there's a lot of critical moments, such as hiring, promotions, performance evaluations. And so these are moments where it's critical that the people that are participating in these processes become very aware of their unconscious biases. Now, as mediators, every moment is a critical moment. Every moment in our mediation is a moment that matters. So that is why some of the journey that I showed earlier, it's so important that you do take the time to work on that yourself because it impacts your everyday. Now, I'd like to get your feedback. So, of course, as mediators, these are all the things that you do, but I'd like to see from your perspective, where do you see in the process of mediation that unconscious bias could impact you the most? Any thoughts? Give you a minute to think. Do we think that unconscious biases are impacting at all our mediations? That's a loaded question, isn't it? Thank you, Patty. Leaving out options. That's a really good one, right? As we are hearing some of the options that are being put forth by the parties, there might be things that we simply don't pick up on, right? Or comes into play in all of these areas. All of them. Yes. So all of these things that you do as part of your mediation process can be impacted. And ask the mediator how you are paraphrasing, how you're reflecting back, what options you're putting out on the table, what kind of reality checks you choose to do as you're coming closer to an agreement. Those are all very, very critical things to make sure that we are as neutral as humanly possible. There are times where we are more vulnerable and susceptible to fall into bias traps. Some of them can be when we have information overload, when there is just so much to process that we end up taking cognitive shortcuts. The opposite can be when we don't have any information. And in the absence of that information, we end up filling in those gaps with our personal point of view. And then the last one is the need for speed. When you've just got to make a decision, you're under pressure, you cut corners, and you come to a place in your personal judgment without looking at all the options. So in your personal life overall, do you see one of these having more impact on you typically? I'd love to hear on the chat. Feelings over facts. With our crazy life, the time constraints that we have, right? Just having to make decisions left and right. So when you are doing a mediation and you are aware of either there was just so much to process or we don't have enough information, this is when to stop, come in. Thank you, Walter, for sharing and being vulnerable. I think we've all caught ourselves in being in one of these situations. And so in mediation, when you see that there's one of these things occurring, information overload, feelings over facts, or need for speed, slow down, reflect, take time. So now I want to get to some of the strategies for us to disrupt our biases, specifically around mediation. So before a mediation and during a mediation, before you go into a mediation, there is a test that I'm going to send a link to called the implicit association test. This test was created by researchers at Harvard, and there's many versions of this survey. And what this survey does is, say you're looking at the category of white skin versus dark skin. Through answering a series of questions with speed and associating different concepts, positive and negative concepts, you are able to determine how likely it is that you answer one way or another. The same is for age, for body weight, for gender and leadership. So this is not a foolproof test, and there is some controversy behind it. But I have found doing this test and then coming back and taking it after doing personal work, that it is at least a benchmark for yourself. And some of these things might be interesting. Like we hear a lot of people that are like myself, 50 and over, having a preference towards younger people. So it's just something very interesting to hear, not to hear, to see from your answers and then be able to reflect on that. The second thing that I recommend is to as you've identified your stereotypes, then go and break your stereotypes. A good way to do that is to expose yourself to images that go against the stereotype that you have. So when you're doing, for instance, performance review, and you're doing an assessment of somebody that is not like you, you might expose yourselves to working mother images. If that's a category where you believe you might have a stereotype, or expose yourself to underrepresented successful people that you admire. Just by looking at these images, it helps with the process of breaking your stereotypes. The third step is really declaring yourself. Finding why this is important to you and taking the time to write down why it's important to you is such a powerful step. And part of doing that, declaring yourself is what I call it, is writing an anti-bias pledge. I'm going to share mine also with a handout, and it's very extensive. It doesn't have to be extensive. It just has to go back into yourself and give yourself the ability to reflect why it's important to you and what is it that you're committed to doing with your actions. And that's the last part, committing to improvement. And what you're doing here today and learning about this is part of that process and being committed to improvement. Now, think about during a mediation, what are those things that you can do then? I like to read my anti-bias pledge before I start. Also, halfway through, taking a anti-bias break or a bias break, right? You're going to have gathered a lot of information that you didn't have before. So as you take a break, ask yourself these questions. Are the participants similar to you, different from you? In which ways? Do you identify with one of the clients, with one of the attorneys, and why? Are there values that they have shared through the conversation very different from you from a religious or social or parenting perspective? So becoming aware of these different pieces of information really helps you come back with renewed neutrality. Another thing that I like to do is what I call deliberate empathy, where I vocally express, if you have a co-mediator with your co-mediator or yourself, what are the merits of both sides of the equation? And then last, as you're going through your mediation, your body might be telling you when you might be experiencing or when you might be more susceptible to bias. Is your breath getting faster? Is your heart beating quickly? Are you feeling irritable? Are your muscles tensing up? So if you have any of these things happening, take a pause and again, reflect what might be causing that. So this is one thing that you can always take with you as far as bias. What is important is your second thought, but your first action. So these are some of the things that are so critical, where it doesn't matter if you are having these thoughts before. What really matters is going to be what you do with your thoughts, even if you're having a second thought and a third thought and a fourth thought. So before we continue moving forward, I do want to pause, because the best thing that you can take from this conversation today is taking the time to reflect on what you have heard and making a statement around one small thing that you can do to disrupt your personal biases at a personal level. So since I have you all on the call, I'm going to pause for 1 minute and have you think about that. And if you could share this in the chat with the rest of us, that would be very helpful. People learn a lot from each other and they think, oh, that's one thing I hadn't thought to do. So I'm going to be silent for 60 seconds as you have time to reflect and write one small practice that you will do to disrupt your biases? Beautiful. Thank you, everyone, for sharing. I'm going to read a few of them, but actually, I would like to ask if anybody would like to talk about that personal practice that they're sharing with us on the chat. Would anybody like to share? So many great things. So Bruce shares, take a break in our mediation, discuss with a co-mediator. Thank you. Jennifer is reflecting back to us that there are flashcards. I'm gonna go and see that to help balance out the bias against Black bodies. I'm gonna add that to the tools in case people want to see that. Thank you for sharing, Jennifer.
Yeah, and I have noticed that it makes a difference. You see examples of Black excellence, and I was going through them at breakfast, and then I would start seeing people differently and think, oh, I wonder, if there's somebody in their family line who's done this, or if they've done something like this. So I did notice a difference.
Wow. Thank you, Jennifer. Sometimes I show people um, some pictures of women in hard hats in a construction site, if that is kind of one of the relevant stereotypes. Sometimes even seeing some men in dancing ballet. But what you're talking about here, and I haven't seen this specific flashcards, but really being able to see successful people that we admire and respect um, has an impact on how you see the group. A couple more reflections here. I try during breaks to take a deep breath and close my eyes to force myself to focus on facts and positions without putting a face on them. Thank you, Steve Schulwolf. That's very powerful. Take a time out. Anybody else that would like to share what they thought about with their commitment? Okay, well, the future. So we have come today to the place where you now understand what is a bias, what are the different kinds of bias, and some examples of how they manifest themselves. We have also talked about some strategies. This is just a beginning. There's so many more. Some of them are going to align very closely with you and who you are, and some of them will be less applicable to you. But there's definitely more knowledge to be had. And then the self-awareness is one of those key things that continuously has to go. And that's something that you need to commit yourself. And going from the knowledge to the self-awareness to the work is so critical. And then we have about 10 minutes where I would really like to open it up to questions and conversation. Like I mentioned in the beginning, we are going to be sending a handout with links to the implicit association test, some guidance around how to create your anti-bias personal statement, and some tools that you can use, like the flashcards that Jennifer shared with us. So, are there any questions or comments? And feel free to put them on the chat or speak up.
All right, I'll ask a question to get the ball rolling. What are your thoughts of, I think one of the assumptions here is that if we all dig deeply, even the best intended mediator has some biases, and we need to address those. Where's kind of the line, in your opinion, in terms of like ethically of, when there just might be a matter that you shouldn't mediate because the biases are to such a high extent. I think there's a tension between, we want to make our services available to everybody, and a self-awareness in terms of where the level is, where we think we might not be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. That is such a great question, Steve. And sometimes we might not know that we are having such a strong reaction until we are in the middle of the mediation. So I think that the first thing is, if you have that deep awareness, and for instance, somebody might feel strongly about a religious position, you're in a family case, and one of the parents is directly in opposition with your deeply held beliefs. I think at that point, it's always going to be a judgment call. But if you have a co-mediator, it's great to be able to use them to talk about that. And if there is no co-mediator, then it really is going to go back to your awareness. Can you continue to be impartial? But even asking the question allows you to become more neutral and unbiased. I don't know if that makes sense, but just by the fact that you're looking at it and you're asking that question, it creates an increased neutrality. There is no science, unfortunately. Like, we'll answer these 5 questions, yes or no, and if you have an average of 3 out of 5, then excuse yourself. Any other questions? If you have any questions that, for whatever reason, were not shared here today, you have my email, and we will be gathering any questions that come to me or to the leadership of the Austin Mediators Association, and crafting answers so that everyone can see those answers. This is what I like to call an organic process. It's not a chemical reaction kind of process. It's not like you get the information and then you mix a little bit of awareness and whew, you are where you want to be. It's more of an agricultural process where we're planting seeds, and those seeds might take a little bit of time to really process and germinate. This is a very complex subject. And that is why I want to make myself available. If this lands later today, next week, and you have some questions, please let me know. I'm very happy to answer those questions. And if there is any other question, wow. It looks like you have 5 minutes to go and grab some lunch before your next 1 o'clock.
Thank you so much, Venus, for talking today. I love that analogy that it's like more a seed that you plant that still needs to be tended to. I think that that's such a great analogy.
Definitely is. It and it takes some sunlight and watering, and I see in myself this awareness germinating every day, even though I live and breathe it. I get new ones left and right.
Thea has included a survey if any of the attendees would fill that in for us just about the meeting today. And also, if you've joined by phone, if you would email us or message me your name so that I could send you your certificate of attendance. And I'll be mailing those out with the worksheet on Monday, so keep an eye out for that.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Venus. I know we, as the board of the Austin Mediators Association, also had talked about for folks who are interested in these issues and in the future might want to be more involved in finding great speakers like Venus and putting on programs. We have an opening and would love for somebody who's interested in that to contact us and be involved. But Venus, thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been such a pleasure.
I just wanted to mention one thing because I've known Venus for a long time and I have seen her path to get here. And I just want to say how very impressed and happy I am that your path took you to mediation and to here. And, you know, you can see it in this presentation. It was really wonderful.
Thank you, Diane. Miss seeing you.
Yeah, same here.
You still have time for a quick question?
I do.
So you said that you've done mediations, and I was just wondering, in your mediations, if you could give us an example of two where you've really noticed your bias coming up and how you address that, or are there, from your experience in mediation, are there typical situations that bias is going to come up for all of us?
Well, I'm going to answer the first question with a little bit of a joke. When people ask me what I'm allergic to, I tend to reply, mean people. And I answer a little in jest, but the truth is, where I've seen my bias really pop up has been when I've experienced just plain mean, rude people treating each other in a very, very disagreeable way. And so I am always aware that when I perceive somebody that is bullying somebody else, I need to be very careful in ensuring that I am maintaining that neutrality and seeing the merits of the person that is being rude and mean. So that has been one of my top on the list of things that I need to address personally. And your second question, I'm sorry, your second question was around things that we can do overall as mediators. Would you mind?
I think it was just if there was some like very common areas where we probably are all prone to bias, and maybe not. Maybe it's just, it really is a person by person type of thing. But I didn't know if there was some common areas within the mediation context that might, that we should be extra aware of. This could very well pop up in these
Yes.
situations.
That's a great question. And I think the answer comes back to your values. So is there one area for all mediators across? No. It is really your personal biases are going to be influenced by who you are, what you value, what you like, what you don't like. So that's why having your own awareness of those things and your identity helps you in in addressing those biases.
Thank
One
you.
more thing. Oh, sorry. One more thing. I wonder if you could put back up the original, your first, I think it was your first slide that had your mission statement kind of on it. I was writing it down and then it got moved. About your belief in your words and actions and inactions. Yeah, that's what I'm looking for. I want to write it down and maybe steal it.
Of course. And this is part of my personal pledge of belief and action. And I will share this with everyone. I posted it recently, the full thing. This is one of probably 10 statements. I posted the full thing on my LinkedIn. So if you go and look at my LinkedIn, you'll be able to find it there and print the whole thing as well.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
And Venus, I know you mentioned that you'll be, giving us some handouts to send out in the next few days.
Mhm.
I just want to mention, if you're willing to share your slide deck, that might be helpful too. I know there were some slides there that I was also wishing I could quickly write down, but it's up to you, but that would be helpful.
Okay, absolutely. I am happy to share this. I think that the more that people can become aware of these different things, the better we are as a world, as a community. So, and my offer stands because the power is really in the conversation. Anybody wants to have a conversation around this, just hit me up. Any other questions?
Did you provide your email somewhere? Maybe I missed it.
Yes, it is Venus@VectorU. Oh, click, 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 click. There we go. At vectoru.global.
Thank you so much.